Before we get started, if you haven't seen the movie yet, I highly recommend you don't watch this video until after you do, because yes, it's going to contain spoilers. With that out of the way, let me give you my review of the movie I watched, Nuremberg. So I actually went and watched the movie this past Sunday, so about 2 days ago, and originally I was going to invite some friends. Unfortunately, plans didn't seem to fit with any of their schedules, so I ended up just going alone to the AMC theater in Boston and watching the Nuremberg movie myself, which I gotta admit I really did enjoy. I think I got a lot more out of it watching myself than if somebody was with me. Basically, the movie follows a protagonist who's played by the actor Rami Malek of Dr. Douglas Kelly, who was an actual physician in the United States Army. He was a psychiatrist in training, and he was deployed after the Third Reich collapsed in Germany to understand the behavior of why Hitler's henchmen behaved the way they did and the atrocities they committed during the Third Reich, such as the Holocaust. And Dr. Kelly, during his time, spent a lot of notes and his studies on the major players within Hitler's inner circle, which include Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, Rudolf Hess, and several others. There were leaders in the war crimes that were committed by the regime. Basically, this was the first time in history that the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were going to try these 22 men for 4 specific crimes. Conspiracy to commit crimes was the first one, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, which the last one being basically attributions to the Holocaust and genocide. Not every single person was given a conviction on all 4 counts, and then in the real trial, 11 people were sentenced to death by execution. The remaining people got life imprisonment and were later released after serving a couple years when the new Germany was formed after German reunification. So that's kind of like the basic rundown of Nuremberg. But again, the movie strictly focuses on Dr. Douglas Kelly and what he did. So Rami Malek essentially goes and he is brought up in this new Germany that's basically collapsed and now is basically under occupation from the 4 Allied powers. The movie starts off in Austria, where there's a scene on the road of refugees and veterans of the Third Reich that are going to basically a place we don't know, most likely a place they're going to be rounded up, questioned, and then try to be reintegrated back into society post-war. And then the first thing is Hermann Göring's car shows up and he surrenders to the Americans, which was an actual true part in the real Nuremberg case. He fled to Austria, which at that time was occupied by the Americans. Not all of Austria, just the part he fled to. And he surrendered to the Americans, in which he was sent back to Germany. He was stripped of his insignia, and he was basically housed in a detention center. He had a translator with him, and he had orders to go see him. And while the movie's kind of progressing, he was really trying to understand why they committed those crimes. And he didn't really understand what Göring and the other people in Nuremberg actually did until the trial actually began, when they showed images of the camps, the death camps. Göring was trying to defend himself, saying that he only wanted emigration of the inferior races out of Germany, and him, who was actually dead before Nuremberg started, misunderstood Göring's orders and essentially resulted in the death of people instead of their emigration and deportation. But essentially this really changed Dr. Kelly's perspective on Göring from just a person who did the wrong mistake to a genocidal war criminal. And this is really emotional for him because he actually had a very good relationship with Göring when he was in the prison before the trial even started. He got to meet Göring's daughter and his wife, and he would always send letters to them, and they would send letters back to Göring wishing how he was doing in prison. And he got into a very good relationship with his family outside of the prison. Dr. Kelly thought that Göring would eventually be released because he didn't know what the true crimes were until he found out what the actual crimes were during the trial, upon which his relationship completely soured and it turned a completely 180 from the way he saw Göring. So the movie kind of ends with this very violent scene where he doesn't want to see Göring's face again, and how his translator actually was Jewish, and how he loved Germany so much, and he sacrificed a lot for the country, and how when the Nazis got into power, they kicked him out and they murdered his parents. It was very emotional from multiple angles, not just only from Goering's family and what the crimes that they did, but also Dr. Kelly's own translator and people within his team that were trying to understand what these people were doing. His goal was to obviously write a book, and unfortunately that never came to pass, as the U.S. Army was suspecting that he wasn't getting the job done, which was basically trying to get espionage from them and breaking doctor-patient confidentiality, which resulted in him being discharged from the Army right before the sentencing was given for Nuremberg. So the movie kind of ends with Goering committing suicide himself the day before he's actually found guilty and executed, which was actually part of the real Nuremberg trials as well. Everybody else that was sentenced to death was hanged on the day of the execution, and the remaining people that were sentenced to life in prison were sent to various prisons in the Soviet Union, in Germany, and were basically just housed there for a couple years until, under the new German government, they were eventually released. So it really goes to show that this psychiatrist really wanted to do a lot of help and trying to get to understand what these problems were, but his emotions really got in the way. And when he found out the true crimes of what Hermann Göring did and all the other inner circle members of the Third Reich, he really got super depressed, and he was worried that the way the Americans were treating them was no different than the way the Third Reich officers treated people when they were ruling Germany during World War II. So Dr. Douglas Kelly grew very critical of the U.S., and he was worried about fascism and Nazism coming in the U.S., and he tried to warn Americans when he came back home. People called him a freak and a liar and saying that was never going to happen. America was the good guy that saved the world from Nazism. And unfortunately, nobody was ever to really understand what he was going through. So unfortunately, just like in the real story, he committed suicide by taking a cyanide pill, just like Hermann Göring did. And what's really sad about it is he committed suicide in front of his family when he was watching a Rose Bowl game, a football game, just sitting there and relaxing. And cyanide kills you in about 30 seconds. So he just bit on the glass ampule and he ended up dying. So that's kind of like the movie gist in terms of like the big details. There were some other players involved, such as the prosecutors for the British and the Americans, whom the American prosecutor was trying to get an appointment to be a Supreme Court justice after the war. There was a couple of other people at play, but essentially the movie focused on Göring and Dr. Douglas Kelly. So with that, I just kind of want to share my thoughts about the movie. So this movie was really emotional. The first half of the movie was more about kind of getting to understand and see the settings of what was going on, but really about halfway into the movie when they were showing the camps and the horrors and the images that portrayed of what these people did to other people, it was absolutely just horrifying. And in the movie you could even see Dr. Kelly just crying in tears and just basically being felt betrayed by Göring and the other Nazis he was interviewing with. And there were just so many emotional aspects in the movie because we had an emotional relationship build with Dr. Douglas Kelly, Göring's daughter, and his wife, and how they were completely innocent and didn't know what was going on. And you also had Göring himself, who was trying to change, didn't know why he was being jailed. And then Dr. Douglas Kelly, and then Dr. Douglas Kelly's translator, who was also a victim of what these people did, and and his translator sharing his story of how they killed his parents and they made his life much more worse for him and his sister. And then at the end of the movie, them being sentenced to death, and then Dr. Douglas Kelly's betrayal of what was going on, and his basically anger against Göring, and Dr. Douglas Kelly's own depression and worry about how this can happen in the United States. So all these emotional angles really at the end just hit on me so hard that I ended up just walking out in the streets of Cambridge and really just kind of trying to process, like, this was really an emotional roller coaster. I wasn't thinking it was going to be super emotional, but it was, and I'm generally not that moved by movies at all. But because all these events were true stories, and this movie was based on actual events that were documented and recorded during the Nuremberg trials, it really amazes me on how a doctor who is supposed to be taking care of patients can just be so distraught and distressed given certain circumstances and just the environment he's in, and even things that he didn't know were about to come into play that would have worsened the relationship between him and his patients. So that really got like a message of just an emotional downpour on me, and that's why I just felt really moved and very very puzzled and like ambiguous at the end. The biggest takeaway for me was Dr. Kelly's warning on how this ideology doesn't just stop with the end of the Third Reich. It continues on, and his biggest concern and worry was what was going on in America. When the Third Reich was actually going into power, it started off very small with the Nuremberg laws, which is how these laws that later resulted in the Holocaust came, where it was initial second-class citizenship, loss of press, loss of opposition, and then and then slowly came to bloodline and not getting married, and then it went to deportation and emigration of non-Aryan Germans, which eventually led to death camps and the torture and genocide of these people. So it was a slow step in this very meticulous and thought out detail, only a span of like maybe 10 years at its height before it was finally liberated and the Third Reich collapsed. What's really scary is a lot of the stuff that Dr. Kelly said in the movie is actually happening right now in the United States, especially in the Trump administration, where you're seeing this denigration and villainization and dehumanization of people based on where they come from, and how that's slowly creeping away into the infiltration of our government. Our checks and balances are being basically weaned out and eliminated, and now it's becoming a regime where you have ICE agents just patrolling all around cities and attacking people and doing a much more worse job than what was happening during the Nuremberg times. And it's only a matter of time before things get worse. So a lot of the warnings that this army psychiatrist was saying and how the US is completely immune to Nazism and fascism is actually happening right before our very eyes. A lot of these things he didn't want to see and he was afraid of seeing at home are currently happening in 2025 in the United States government. And that's what really made me, I would say, the most emotionally moved, because it's true. A lot of the events that he was fearful of are happening. It's one thing if it happened in the past and then after a couple of generations society has moved on, but it's a cycle that keeps on repeating, and unfortunately there's not a way that none of us can stop it at our current times. So hopefully we can find solutions to that and address those. So the movie Nuremberg is really a framework for how certain movements and totalitarian regimes and systems can always manifest themselves later on, even in places where people least expect it. I hope you appreciate my reflection and what I had to say about Nuremberg. You may have a different opinion on it, you may criticize it, you may like it. This is the very first time I've ever seen a movie in quite some time in Boston, and one that was really emotionally charged as Nuremberg. I don't know if any other movie can top that off. Many thanks, and cheers.